Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So I wanted I'm doing a project for a class right now that's sort of critiquing the national revelation claim of Judaism, and of course you argue very strongly for that. A proponent in your argument, though I don't think it's actually necessary for the argument to function. The proponent is that when you eliminate the possibilities that naturalistically explain how people could accept a claim, you eliminate, for instance, that people. One person couldn't present it to many other people because their parents would have heard them give that over. Would you agree with that or no?
Well, sort of. I do say those words, but I think it's very important to know what role they play in the argument, where they figure in the argument. Yeah. There are really two things going on. There's an intuition, which many people share, though not everyone. And that intuition makes the subject interesting to investigate. But that intuition is not the reason for believing the conclusion. It's not the reason for believing the conclusion. That intuition is not the reason for believing the conclusion. So even if I'm talking to someone who doesn't share the intuition, I have a reason, and that's not it. The idea that a person couldn't make up such a claim because their parents would have known about it, and they know their parents don't know about it, and therefore they wouldn't accept it, that's not the reason for believing the claim. I say that at least 4 times in the chapter. The reason for believing the claim is a historical survey. That stories like this, we have no record of any false story like this. So stories like this just don't go. That's a historical fact. I think this intuition explains the fact to a great extent. If you don't share the intuition, then you don't. Then you don't need to share the intuition. But the fact is, you don't have a single example of a story like this that is known to be false. And if you're going to tell me that this one is false, then you're telling me this one is different from all the stories of this kind in the whole history of mankind. That's something hard to defend.
Would you look at this claim being different when you say specifically just the amount? Because there are other things that makes similar. I mean, no claims for the hundreds of thousands, but the Lakota tribe, for instance.
No. Okay, I have to tell you what's in the chapter. The claim has nothing to do with national revelations. Nothing at all. National aren't mentioned in the claim. The claim is about something else entirely. National revelation happens to be 1 out of 100 examples of the claims that are involved in the principle. The principle has nothing to do with revelation or with Judaism or with religion or with Shabbos or anything else. It's what I call national experiential traditions. That's a tradition that's accepted by a nation, about its own history, and the tradition describes an event which the tradition says happened to the nation at an earlier stage in its history, and the event that it describes was experienced by everyone in the nation at that time in the history, and it was the kind of event that would naturally make a mark on the culture of the nation so that it would be remembered. And the claim is no national experiential tradition of that, fulfilling that definition, has ever been found to be false. It could be a war, it could be a famine, it could be an invention of a new weapon, it could be a migration, it could be many, many different things which have nothing to do with revelations and laws and traditions and anything. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with only being a national experiential tradition. Sinai happens to be also, among all the other types, also a national experiential tradition. If no traditions of this type have ever been found to be false, that's a very good reason to think that when you don't know about that, whether it's true or false, is true. Because if this is the kind of thing which is random and happenstance, you'd expect of all the traditions of this type in the history of the world, maybe 6 would have been discovered to be false, like 6 at least. And that being the case, since none have been discovered to be false, we have vast empirical evidence that traditions of this type aren't false. That's how the argument goes.
Religious claims are mutually exclusive. So you look at I'm just going to spell it out, SIOUX, I think. They claim a tribal revelation, which is like a woman moves from, I think that's a bird. The bird communicates to multiple different tribes. So that claim could not be, I mean, you could argue with sort of the intermediary understanding of how idols work, that could also be true in this Jewish paradigm. But I think from a bottom-up approach, that seems to be a mutually exclusive claim. This is a different religion that's claiming a type of natural revelation that moves on through oral tradition. And being that both of them can't be true, one of them has to be false, correct?
No, they could both be false. But I have investigated such claims, and I have published the results of the investigation. For example, there's supposed to be a Native American tribe which has a tradition of a revelation of God to a whole tribe. Right? So somebody said this to me 20 years ago, and I sent it around to one of my students. The student did some research, and he said, yeah, we looked it up. Here's how the story goes. Tribe A has a tradition. Tribe A's tradition is that the whole of Tribe B heard God speak, and then they all died. No survivors. No later generations. And the priest of Tribe A told them about the revelation of Tribe B. That doesn't count because it's got to be the ancestors of the people who have the tradition that the event describes as happening to their ancestors. And here that's not true. We only have Tribe B that believes it. It's the wrong tribe. Okay. Sorry.
So what would that do for your argument if it actually was the case that there was a multiple tribe revelation?
Well, it depends upon what it means. There's one case where they describe such a thing, and it's not clear whether everyone in the tribe heard God speak, or the priests heard God speak and told the tribe what the...
In both the Lakota and the SIOUX, how do you pronounce that, by the way?
What's that?
The SIOUX.
Sioux.
Sioux. But the Sioux claims, my understanding, it claims multiple tribes. The bird brings multiple tribes together. The Lakota is one tribe that passes down an oral tradition. With both claims supernatural occurrences, being that I'm assuming they can't be true if Judaism is true.
Well, first of all, I want to see the details in the way. I did a lot of detailed study on the Aztec claim for national revelation. It turned out to be absolutely with no material behind it. But
what's wrong with the Aztec one?
Okay, I published that. It's a long, detailed thing. First of all, I went to scholars who went to the text and translations of the text, and checked the dating. It has to be dated within a common date frame, where you have continuous intervening history. One of the conditions that I set out in the chapter is if you put it far enough in the past so that no information from that period of time exists at the time that you're creating the tradition, then you can make it up.
Okay.
But then you have to have it dated. Well, they have it the 3rd year of the camel, in the 15th year of the donkey, and so forth and so on. It's an incoherent dating system. It doesn't relate to our dating system at all. So you can't tell when the date is. You can't tell when the date is. I'm sorry, it doesn't qualify. All these details have to be checked. It's not so simple as looking it up in, on Google.
And the Jewish date makes it so that, the 300 years before, let's say, 1000 BC, so you have like Shlomo, right?
Yeah.
So that would be, that's an area of history you couldn't account for, that we have accounted for, so that claim couldn't be inserted then, correct?
At whatever time you think that this literature was invented, the literature includes events, some of the national events, which are dated, and the names of the people are there, and what happened to their children and grandchildren, who their grandfathers were, and where they lived before that, and the migrations are all there. The whole history is filled in. And that history, according to the Kuzari principle, you're not going to be able to make up. If somebody says it happened, we're sitting here in 2023, 24, right? Somebody says it happened 4,000 years ago in the middle of China. You wouldn't know anything about that. You don't have the ancestors who have a direct physical line down to the people that you're talking about now. How did the information reach you? It could have been made up 300 years ago and given to you, and they wouldn't have known anything about it, and you wouldn't have known anything about it. You've got to show that there's a single national line, and that there's a dating system in the national line, so you can date the event, and the date then has to be something where other information is available to that national group when the tradition is being created. There's other information that's available to them that they can identify the date with, and so forth and so on. All that detail has to be filled in. To say they have a tradition isn't good enough. All these details, and I do this in the book in detail, over and over again. I do in the appendix. I do it over and over again. So I've done the work. The logic is all there. Look at the Aztec thing. I think it's on my blog. I did the Aztec thing in stages. The amount of material made it absolutely insubstantial. Yeah.
So in last week's parsha, also later in the parsha, it speaks about Kishup, it speaks about magic and Shaitan. In today's day and age, it does not, from scientifically, it does not seem that magic exists. So how do we understand let's speak back Kisha from Torah and which way?
Well, of course, you can always take the Rambam's view that it's all just fake.
How would we understand other views? I'm familiar with the Rambam with the Das Yachid.
I wouldn't say it's Das Yochid, but there are those who are cholik. Yes, that's true. Well, since we don't have any detail of what it is they actually did, it's hard to say that we have scientific proof that it doesn't work. We don't know what it is. We haven't tried it. So I think that's something which shouldn't be just swallowed wholesale. And we do have a principle of nishtanu ativim, that the laws of nature have changed. That's used by Rishonim to account for various things that it says in the Gemara. So we're not committed to the idea that if it worked then we would say it must be working now. And all the current science is saying is that we don't see it happening now. Right? They can't testify that the laws of nature operated in the ways that are relevant to this at that time. So.
That was and let's say in some countries, in some far Eastern countries, they claim there are witches and they claim to be able to do magic. So if would we consider these days to be kishuf, or would we say it's just for no reason or something?
I have no idea. I don't know the halachas of kishuf well enough to say what counts as what the Torah proscribes as kishuf or not. That's a detailed study that I'm not available to. I think that the attitude that science has explained everything and we know it all, and if it doesn't accord with science, that it can't be right, is a dreadfully prejudiced, ideology-bound, and unjustifiable position to take.
What is it prejudiced against?
Well, I'll tell you, one thing it's prejudiced against is change. Because when you say science, you mean today's science that you know today. And if you're going to use science you know today as a criterion for accepting or rejecting a claim, let's say, of an observation, then you could never learn that your science today was wrong on the basis of someone seeing something which rejects it, because you won't accept it. Imagine somebody took that position 1,500 years ago. So there'd be no relativity, there'd be no quantum mechanics, there'd be no Maxwell unification. None of that would be true, because all of that violates the Aristotelian view of the universe. No sane person thinks that he uses the science that he has at a particular time to judge whether to accept a claim or not. You accept the claim by investigating its evidence and testing it and seeing whether you can find corroborating observations and so forth and so on, the way you would in any open-minded scientific investigation.
But it's a necessary axiom to make any progress. I mean, you have to make connections between patterns if you're going to assume that there's this disjointed relation between the present and the past, such that we can't know anything about what we know about the past doesn't inform what we know about we know about the present doesn't inform what we know about the past. You don't really get a cohesive model. Like we have to assume that the universe is the same to make inferences about the past. If that's what it is.
Oh, sure, but as Stephen Weinberg wrote in his book, The First Three Minutes, and Stephen Hawking wrote in A Brief History of Time, where he talked about the cosmological principle, which he says we accept on the basis of humility. We're not special. Nothing can be different about us in principle than any other place in the universe. And you can't draw conclusions about the universe unless you make that assumption. And he asked himself, why do we accept that principle? Basically, humility. I don't mind if you make assumptions. You can make assumptions and draw conclusions. Just on page 1, make a list of all the assumptions you made in order to draw your conclusions, and let the reader decide whether he wants to buy those assumptions or not. They're not demonstrated by your work. They're the basis on which you use as axioms to derive your work, and you made them as assumptions.
One model is much more progressive than another.
You mean it fits the leftist agenda?
I mean, like scientific theories, for example. I mean, they're contingent on axioms, they're contingent on 3 laws of logic, but they work. They produce empirical, demonstrable results.
Well, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. As a matter of fact, the revolutions of the 20th century, and some that are still yet to come, are on the basis that they didn't deliver. The early quantum theory prediction for the calculation for the energy of electron was infinity. Was that right?
No, but that changed because we got
But why did it make the prediction in the first place? Because it wasn't right. So that means you had a theory and some of its predictions were wrong. They weren't right. And
based on better evidence.
sure, but that means that in the second case, when you have the better evidence, and maybe even better evidence, it'll make a change in the future.
The nature of the rational mind is you accept if you have a sufficient amount of evidence for a particular claim, you're going to accept that until you have better evidence.
Well, it couldn't be sufficient. I mean, well, how much is sufficient then? If better evidence is possible, then it doesn't mean that this so-called sufficient evidence renders it true. So what makes it sufficient?
But science doesn't make proclamations of truth.
Sure it does. Otherwise, evidence is only evidence of truth. That's all it's evidence for.
The evidence of what's likely to be correct about reality, which we accept as truth. We don't need Cartesian proof.
Likely to be correct doesn't mean it's likely to be false. Then you certainly don't accept it. Sorry.
What do you mean likely to be correct? If it's likely to be correct, it's not likely to be false.
On the contrary, if it's likely to be correct, it is likely to be false.
It's unlikely to be false. There's a possibility that it's false.
No, come on. If it's likely to be corrected, think what we're saying now. If it's likely to be corrected, that means it's likely.
Likely to be corrected. Okay, I think it's likely to be correct. Sorry.
Well, you said likely to be corrected, did you not?
Misspoke, or you misspoke. Okay.
So let's try it again. Likely to be correct?
Yeah.
And doesn't correct mean true?
In terms of what we're accepting, sure.
I don't know what that means. Correct I can discover that what I accepted until now wasn't correct, can I not?
Yeah, if you get better evidence.
Good. So that means that what I accepted doesn't have to be correct and doesn't have to be true. Better evidence can show me to give that one up because it isn't true.
But it warrants belief as given the time.
Oh, I don't know about that. Let's work on that now. I'm glad that you're reducing the claim and taking it back and so forth and so on. That means we're making some progress. Huh?
Whatever.
Yeah. So now let's ask this question. Suppose I have competing hypotheses, and one of them has the greatest probability of being true. Is it appropriate to believe that? Of all the hypotheses that are currently on the table.
Is there any other factor? Just the fact that it's most.
I'm asking you. You're the one who made the pronouncement of we should expect when we should accept something to be true. So I'm asking you. You said under these and these conditions, the rational mind will believe it to be true. So I'm asking you whether these count as those conditions according to your view.
If you have multiple competing hypotheses and one of them is probably true, we're going to accept that one is true.
I didn't say probably true. Please try to be medaic in my words. I said it's more probable than the competitors.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, so let's.
In the field, but yeah.
Good. So let's take an example. Let's take three hypotheses, A, B, and C. A has a 1% probability of being true. B has a 2% probability of being true, and C has a 3% probability of being true. Do you believe C?
Wait, 3 out of 100?
Yeah, 3 out of 100.
Okay, this is why I asked for specifics, because if you're going to reduce probabilities where it's so low,
Yeah.
it might be the case where we have different ideas, but none of them are demonstrable or predictable enough to warrant belief.
Good. So then what I said before is not a correct criterion. It's not enough to have comparative superiority of probability.
Unless there's a significant disparity.
17% versus 2? Is that enough? 22% versus 2?
Depends on the claim.
So 22% versus 2 will be good enough, even though it's 80% probably that it's false? No, so it's not enough. Well, okay, do you understand that you're shifting grounds now? The philosophy of science is a study. It's not something you can Google. It's a study, and it has hundreds of examples of these kinds of criteria and what the counterexamples are to these kinds of criteria. Take a textbook. You can learn this stuff. This is not deep research here. The criterion for accepting a hypothesis is undefined. There's no accepted definition for when you accept a hypothesis. Richard Rorty said this at a national convention. I happened to be there because I was a professional philosopher. I heard him say this, and although I despise his philosophy in general, I thought this remark was very profound. There's every scientific theory that has ever been proposed and accepted had known counterexamples. That means when you shifted from one theory to another, you were shifting from one theory with its counterexamples to another theory with its counterexamples. And how you make the decision when to choose the second theory with its counterexamples versus the first theory with its counterexample, no one has a definition of when to do that. So you're talking about something which is done largely by intuition and instinct, and there's a kind of group training that gives a large unanimity in many cases, not in every case. String theory is to this day bitterly controversial. As one book titled it, not even false. Not even false, because not meaningful. And others think it's the truth. That's bitterly controversial in a pretty tight scientific field called cosmology and ultimate physics. So the criterion for doing that is something for which there's no precise criterion whatsoever. There may be isolated individual sufficient conditions, that would be helpful. Under this particular narrow sufficient condition, then the right move to do is this. But typically you don't have it. Yeah.
Yeah, does having in Gemara a lot of times we have quite major machlokes about the din. So how can you say them?
What were the first words? Something
In
machlokes?
many places in Chazal,
Yeah.
you find major machlokes.
Major. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
About certain din. So how can we say that we have a clear Messiah on something if there's like two competing examples?
Okay. This is a very important question. There's a wonderful book called The Dynamics of Dispute by Tzvila and Pell, where he has a couple of chapters on this subject. What people don't know, though, with the classical education you should know, things that were practiced uniformly for 1,000 years or 2,000 years can later become controversial. Things that were practiced uniformly for thousands of years can later become controversial. For example, a halacha that's based on the pshat in a pasuk, Meforish a pasuk. It could be Yehoshua's Sanhedrin, the Meforish the pasuk. Ezra's Sanhedrin has a right to disagree. They don't have to be makabel Meforish the parish on a pasuk, no matter how many generations go by. Bigger in number and Chachma only applies when Rama to Derabanans, not to Deraisis. Every generation has the authority to decide differently. So something which was done one way the whole time, at that generation, when the pshat in the pasuk becomes controversial, can all of a sudden become controversial. And then you see, that's multiple traditions. How could there be an unchallenged uniform tradition for 1,000 years? Because it can become controversial. That's one way. Of Dessler, in I think it's volume 4, on page 55. One second. Dessler says, for example, for tefillin, Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi, which aren't Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi, of course, as you know, because 1,000 years before them we found examples of these tefillin. That was based on halacha of Sinai, and there's a rule with halacha of Sinai. Halacha of Sinai is a halacha as long as you have the word-for-word formulation of the halacha. If that's what you have in your possession, then it's a binding halacha. If you lose the word-for-word formulation, even though you know what people did, if you lose the formulation, then it ceases to be a halacha. And the word that Dessler uses is it becomes a no-hag. I misunderstood that when I read it. I spoke to one of his talmidim, and he says, it doesn't say minhag, it says no-hag. A minhag, you have a rule, minhag Yisrael kedinu. No-hag means it's things that people do. And Rav Dessler says, if you're a Tani, you can challenge it on the basis of psukim. If you're an Amora, you can challenge it on the basis of Tanoim. And if you're a post-Gemara, you can challenge it on the basis of the decisions of Shas. It becomes challengeable, and then it becomes controversial. So these are two ways in which things which had an unbroken tradition became controversial at a later time. There may be more that I'm leaving out. But once you have that principle in your hands, then the standard complaint of the conservatives that it must have been made up when not before the time when it was controversial, just falls flat.
So it means that the Rabbanim would change the Torah? Because you have one Hanhaga, then all of a sudden we decide, no, we're going to change it to a different.
I understand. Let's take the first example, right? The halacha is based on being meforish a pasuk, right? So the Sanhedrin have the authority to derive halachos by being meforish pasukim. Is that part of their authority given to them by the Torah? Yes, it is. Every generation's Sanhedrin has the authority to do that, right? And they're not required to follow the portion of previous generations. So, in what way is he changing the Torah? He's using the same authority, and because of his understanding of the psukim, he comes to a different conclusion.
So the Torah we practice might be different than the Torah we practice by the entire time.
Of course. Many of the things that we do today are laden with the Rabbanans, which came into existence later.
I'm talking about the Rabbanim.
Oh.
I'm talking about like the devices, how we have different.
Yeah. Because even the rices can change, of course. That's right. Yeah.
clarity on how you use truth, general truth position. So if something has not been demonstrated to be true, it's not been demonstrated to be false, you agree that that doesn't warrant your belief, right?
I think demonstration is a much too strong a term. You haven't got a demonstration of who your parents are. I think it's okay to believe who your parents are.
Let's say there isn't, well, I guess you'd argue what sufficient means regarding any particular claim. But
Maybe, but the word demonstration carries mathematical content. I don't know what you mean by demonstration then.
if there isn't sufficient evidence for a claim, does that mean that the claim is, it doesn't mean that the claim is false?
Correct. It certainly does not.
The claim is true.
Correct.
How do you respond with your belief to that claim?
Usually I suspend belief.
Right, so you don't have a positive belief in that thing.
That's right.
Okay, so why is it and I just want to understand, when you look at the other, let's say, hypothetical situations of national revelation, you would say, well, has it ever been demonstrated to be false? You can't find one that's not been demonstrated to be false, likely to be true.
Okay, that's a good question. I answer that in the book explicitly, and I have a long footnote on it. But I'll answer for you as well. The critic is claiming that it is natural, normal, and expectable that there will be false traditions of various kinds, because the people who make them up for subjective reasons, to glorify their ancestors or to explain things to them that are puzzling without having any reason to think that this is a real explanation. Or they're just too simplistic to be critical about the thoughts that they are making. And therefore they make up lots and lots of traditions which aren't true. There are many, many traditions that aren't true. They just aren't national experiential traditions. There are traditions about what individuals did, where individuals came from, and traditions about the coming into being of the world that we see. None of those are national experiential traditions, but they're national traditions, and we are convinced that many of them are incorrect. And the attitude of the critic is, your Sinai story isn't any different from them. It's just whether it's the wanderings of Ulysses coming back in the Aeneid, or whether it's the heroes of ancient China who climbed mountains and battled dragons and so forth and so on. You just made up the story, and you made it up like everybody else made it up. So I say, you have an engine. You have an engine that produces traditions, and it often produces traditions that are false. And you say the same engine produced my tradition. Well, if that's true, then you have a good reason to think that mine's false also, because it's produced by an engine that produces false traditions. Okay, so I say, you've got the engine producing all traditions, thousands of kinds. Of the thousands of kinds, I have one half of one, a little sliver over here. Let's take the engine in this particular output, this particular slot, the kinds of traditions that are put out by this particular slot. Now let's take a look at those and see. Do you have any of the ones that are false? No? Then it isn't this engine of making things up subjectively and doing it because you love your ancestors and you can do it because you want to explain things to yourselves. That's not where it's coming from. We'll have to ask, where's it coming from? How come it isn't making the same mistakes as everything else? So my argument that there are no false ones means it's not coming from the same engine that produces all the ones that you know are false, and you can then say this is false by association to all of those. That's what that point is supposed to make.
But the critic doesn't have to claim that it's false. He just says there isn't sufficient evidence for that national revelation claim.
Well, first of all, he has to claim that he has evidence that it's false, and he does claim that. He doesn't say that he doesn't know. He doesn't put the burden of proof on me. The critic says, I've studied anthropology, and I've studied ancient history, ancient religions, and I know your stuff is no different from that, and I have every reason to think that it's false. So the first thing I'm doing is pointing out to him that given this distinction that I've made, he doesn't have reason to think that it's false. That's number one. And now the step further is, this example I used in the footnote. I have a lake in my backyard, a big lake. And I claim that there are fish in the lake, and all the fish in the lake are smaller than 4 inches. I don't have a single example, not one. Not one. Could I possibly have good reason for believing that all the fish in the lake are smaller than 4 inches if I don't have even one example of the cloud that I'm making? Here's how you do it. I found roe in the lake. Okay, so if there's roe in the lake, there's fish. and I dragged the lake with nets with 4-inch holes very thoroughly. I didn't catch any. Then the fish in the lake are smaller than 4 inches without a single example. Sometimes the failure to find a counterexample is good reason to believe in the cloud. It doesn't follow that every cloud of all A's are B's. You have to have lots of A's which are B's to support it. If you have reason to think you have a net that catches the counterexamples and it doesn't come up with any, well, these traditions are, the general class of tradition contains many false traditions because we know how they're made up. We know where they come from. Right? Here, it doesn't come from something like that. Whatever made this up didn't make up any obvious failures. Then it must have a pretty good record of doing things that aren't discoverably false. Well, who would do that? How would they manage that? The answer is because this is something which you can't make up, and if you can't make it up, it's not going to be believed if it isn't true. That's the explanation for why you don't find any false ones. But that's the explanation of not finding any false ones.
And that's assuming that there aren't any other national revelations claims.
No, it has nothing to do with national revelations. If this was the only national revelation claim in the whole history of the world, the same argument would go through it exactly the same way.
All right. What you did is there's the engine, and then here's all the data points, and then you have the outlier, and you say, well, if all of these, you're using the engine to suggest that all of these are false, this one is not produced by the same engine, because it's a different claim by nature, correct, or no?
These ones, national experiential traditions, all of them. This slot turns out national experiential traditions. All of them, hundreds of them. Wars and migrations and technological advancements and diseases and so forth and so on. All the national experiential traditions come out of this slot, and none of those, I said none of them are known to be false. It's got to be them, it can't be just one. None of them is known to be false. So whatever is producing NETs, that engine that's producing NETs doesn't make mistakes.
So the Jewish claim is different because you can't find a counterexample because it's unfalsifiable.
Not unfalsifiable. It's falsifiable, all right. There just aren't any falsified cases. First of all, unfalsifiability, you have to know, is not a good criteria.
What do you mean by
I wrote a paper on that.
falsifiable case?
Okay, let's go through the vocabulary here. This is really, falsifiability is a mistake. Karl Popper was wrong about this, and the people who followed him were wrong about this. And the scientists don't get it. The philosophers get it, and Roger Penrose gets it, because in his book, The Road to Reality, 1,000 pages in which he encapsulates all modern science, he gets it right that falsifiability isn't a good criterion, because he has a counterexample of contemporary science, which is very good science and it's unfalsifiable. Unfalsifiable means it's the kind of hypothesis which no observation could show false. Falsified means we have on record observations already made that show that it is, in fact, false. That's falsified. I'm not talking about unfalsified, I'm talking about unfalsified. None of the NETs that come out of that slot are falsified. They could have been falsified. There are many ways.
All of them in the set and then even the one outside the set have not been demonstrated to be false?
What one outside of this set? I have a set of NETs, all of them.
But I thought, what do you mean when you said sliver? That it sounded like that.
There are traditions about great birds, and there are traditions about men and women who go off and fly to islands. There are traditions about submarine people who swim underwater. There are traditions about the world coming to existence of the blood of the great cow. There are many, many traditions about many, many various beliefs about the ancient world. Right? And all of them, in their vast variety, many of them are false. We have good reason to think they're false. We discount them.
Many of them.
Yes, many of them.
But some of them no. So how do you respond to that?
Well, not everything that the New York Times produces I can show as false, but I have good reasons to think it's false.
What are the reasons you have to?
Because I know their general record. Their general record is pretty bad. So, and especially in certain subjects, it's pretty bad. So I have reason to think that the ones that I haven't yet falsified are also false, by association coming from the same source, knowing the record of the source. That's the point of their argument. The point of their argument is they all come from the same source, and many of them are known to be false. So when you have one, maybe I haven't shown yours to be false yet, but there's a good reason to think it's false, because this source produces false results, some significant number of false results.
And what is the different source that the Jewish one comes from?
Well, I know what it comes from, but
Is it just a general tradition?
no, why so hard to get across? What comes out the sliver is all national experiential traditions. Portuguese and ancient Chinese and Southeast Islands and Australia and everywhere.
Judaism's in that.
Sorry?
Judaism.
The story of the Sinai revelation is one of those. It is a national experiential tradition just as much as the ancient Greek traditions and the ancient Roman traditions, a few of which are national experiential traditions, and which, by the way, historians trust as being real history. I have that in the book. I have the quote in the book where they say traditions like that we trust as being real history.
So what makes the Jewish one escape that?
It doesn't. It's part of that. The claim for the Jewish revelation is exactly the claim for every other national experiential tradition. They're all of one group. They're identical. They get all the same argumentation.
But you said the engine makes all of them false by probability, right? No. That's what the critic is saying, no?
Oh boy. The critic is starting with, let's say, the childhood of Achilles, or the experiences of the prophets of Athene on Mount Olympus, experiences of individual people or small groups of people, or Sir Galahad of the forest when he fought and killed the monster, right, which nobody saw. He just told them about. These are the stories which are made up, and many of them are false. And the engine is glorifying your ancestors, or verifying the religions that you have, or explaining things that you yourself that you can't explain, or whatever it is. These are the psychological explanations for why people make up myths like this. Many of the stories are false, and they're made up for those reasons. Some of them are recorded historical events, but some are not. Many of them are made up. That's for a certain general class of myths. 98% of myths fall into that class. There's another tiny sliver, 2% of all myths, which are a category of national experiential traditions. As I said before, this is a very narrow class. You've got to have a whole nation that accepts it, not a subclass and not a group within a group, a bunch of groups. The whole nation accepts it, and it's a tradition about their own history, not about somebody else's history. I went through the great book of myths. I summarized it in my book. And they actually have two cases in Greek. In Greece, there's a myth about what happened to the whole island of Crete, and there's a myth in England about what happened to a large, geographically significant size group of people in France. But that's an English myth about France and a Greek myth about Crete. But you didn't have any where it was a nation about its own ancestry. So, and then the description has to be that the ancestry experienced an event where everyone experienced it. Not 16 people experienced it, then came and told everybody else. No, everybody experienced it. And it's got to be the kind of event that would make a difference. And that includes the Black Death in Europe, and it includes significant defeat in war, not always victory, because victory could take place when your army's 200 miles away and conquers them. But defeat means they invade you, and they burn your houses, and they rape your women, and they take control, and they tax you, and so forth and so on. Everybody in the defeated nations know they were defeated. These are national experiential traditions, and they happen all over the world. Lots of the traditions aren't NETs. They're different types of traditions, but some of them are NETs. Now, I'm talking about the sliver of world traditions that are NET-type traditions. That's a very small subclass. The vast majority aren't about the whole ancestry, everyone experiencing the event, and the event being so spectacular that it would be remembered. That's a very small subclass. And I say that although in the general group of traditions, including the individuals and people turning into birds and birds turning into people and so forth and so on, which aren't national experiential traditions. In the general group, there are lots of ones that we take for granted are false. And then it would be natural to say, if another one's claim to fame is it's part of this group, that its only claim of fame is part of the general group, That's not a big claim to fame, and we can easily ignore it and say that we have certainly no reason to think that it's true. But when you restrict it to the national experiential traditions all over the world, in all millennia, and so forth and so on, some religious and some not religious, and you find that for this subgroup, no mistakes are made, that it's not coming from the same source. Because the source that you're using, and the source you're using to discredit the individuals, is a source that makes mistakes. And in this case, it doesn't make any mistakes. Well, then it's not that source. So at this point, you have a phenomenon which is different from all the others. And here you have a kind of tradition which has never been known to make a mistake. That's a good reason to think that the traditions in it are true.
The national revelation Jewish tradition itself hasn't been known to be made a mistake?
No, I don't know. I said it. I used the plurals now. In every sentence in the last 3 minutes, I used the plurals, and you've reduced it to one again.
You mean the sliver of the greater myths have never been known to make a mistake?
The national experiential tradition of the Greeks fighting the Romans and losing the war and being slaughtered and chased back, that's one of them. Has nothing to do with Jews, nothing to do with Revelation, nothing to do with Moses or Shabbos or anything else. Has to do with Greek history, right? Migration. We all came from such and such a place, and this was our route, and then we came here, and we settled here, and we had difficulties when we got here, and so on and so on. We invented the bow and arrow at a certain time, and the bow and arrow spread throughout the country, and everybody was shooting bows and arrows. These are all national experiential traditions, and no such tradition has ever been shown to be false. So whatever is creating these traditions doesn't seem to make mistakes. You're going to say that although we have none on record that's been shown to be false, this one's false, well, then my claim is this. The question, what are you claiming? That it could be false, or it's probable that it's false? If you claim that it could be false, I give that to you. I give all possibilities away. You can have them. But you don't make decisions on the basis of possibilities. What you've got to show is that it's probable that it's false. And to show that it's probable that it's false, you ought to have, as I said 20 minutes ago, at least 6 examples. At least 6. Of the hundreds of such traditions, you should have at least 6 that you know are false. If you don't have at least 6, then to say it's probable that it's false is, I think, unsupported. Yeah.
How do we, let's say the Midrashim, which describe, let's say, Moshe Rabbeinu as being a giant, is that to be understood literally, or is it?
The Maharal says the default position in Midrash is that it's not literal. That's the default position.
So,
and you can only know whether it's meant literally or not by the Meforshim.
So would the giant?
I haven't looked that one up, and you haven't looked it up either. Take a look at the Rishonim. See, it might be a machlokes in Rishonim about it. Of course, I hope you're not going to take an a priori position since we don't know it to be physically possible. Therefore, it's got to be false. That's dumb. You'll excuse me. Coming from where we're coming from, we're not bound by the fact that our current science says that it's. I like the ones about the ages of people. So the Rambam says there was only one person in that generation in the beginning of Genesis, right? But even if it was general, right? Oh, we know that can't be. Really, you don't know why people age. As a matter of fact, look it up on Wikipedia, which you trust more than the Bible. You'll find out that there are 10 or 15 different theories about why people age, and none of them is verified. If you don't know why people age, and you don't know what the conditions were then, and you know it's got to be false, excuse me. I know what you're talking about. I'm giving you an example of the kind of attitude that you meet all the time. How can a person live to 900? You don't know he can't live to 900. You don't know that. You don't know what makes people age, and you don't know what the conditions were. Yeah. Okay.
Right. When you say that, I guess how I think about it is just, I don't have to know that they can't live to 900. That's never been the case, as far as I'm aware, so I'm not going to accept that to be true.
I think that's very close-minded of you. If we said there are people alive today who are 900 years old, then you can say, I'm sorry. Such a thing would be reported, Guinness would have found out about it, and it hasn't reported, it isn't true today. But he's telling you it was true 5,000 years ago. Why would you use your experience of what's going on today to predict what was going on 5,000 years ago?
I guess the assumptions.
Yeah.
The fact
that science is that the world is uniform.
But
yeah.
I just think that's a far more reasonable candidate than the supernatural one.
Okay, that's your opinion, but that's not a reason. That's not a reason that should convince anybody else. I think that it's far more reasonable. Okay.
I have reasons why I think that reason.
You do? Well, I would opine that the person who's listening to you would have the freedom to disagree with those reasons as well.
So the NT or NET, this works as being that we've never had one that's been proven to be false in the sliver. But if in the sliver, and there are national revelation claims of supernatural occurrences, that we don't know them to be false, and that the religious claims are mutually exclusive. So how do you think of that? Because they both can't be true.
No, I think that's right, and I took a number of them seriously, and I've published the answers to the ones that people have sent me, and sometimes, like in the Aztec case, it cost considerable research, and I did it, and it's published, so you can look it up.
It's on your blog, and it's like
Yeah.
fully illustrated. So what about like the Lakota, for instance, with the cow and the entire tribe, or the
If I'm not mistaken, there's no date.
right, because okay, so another factor is you have to have a history of dates.
I say explicitly in the chapter that if it's put further in time from the past, and of course you don't give any date, then it could be any time in the past, right? Once upon a time it happened. When? I'm not telling you. So then that's not going to be a candidate.
Okay.
With morals, should one only take morals from the Torah, or can one also use morals from that secular morals?
That's a very, very tricky question because our sources say Kadosh Baruch Hu created us with the ability to know Tov and Ra on our own. The Rambam at the beginning of Perek Hey of the Hilchos Shuvah says explicitly that a person, the Machshavto, or the Yaso, knows the difference between Tov and Ra. And he says in the Moreh Nevuchim that if your reason tells you that something is right to do, and you do it, you'll get a schar min hashamayim. And if your reason tells you something's wrong to do, and you violate it, and you do the wrong thing, you'll get an onish min hashamayim. So that means that your intellectual understanding of right and wrong is enough to be mechayev you, and you get totzos min hashamayim. So you can't simply say that you just accept what the deliverances are of the tradition. Furthermore, when you look at Rishonim especially, but even in Gemaras, you'll find that when you have a halacha that's stated by an explicit pasuk, they use moral reasoning to determine how to understand the pasuk. You know how Chatzi Nezik is learned, right? And they should split. That only works if the two live oxen originally were worth equal. And it doesn't say that in the pasuk. And you might have said, Kadosh Baruch Hu is running the world, there's hashgacha pratis. If this is 1,000, this is 100, I'm doing what he told me to do, I'm following his rules, and that's the right thing to do, but it's wrong. The halacha is Chatzi Nezik. Rashi reads the pasuk of what happens if Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven don't go over to fight. He reads it as, if they don't go over to fight, then they get their portion inside of Eretz Yisrael. Tosha says, that's not fair. You didn't fight, why should you get a portion? And therefore, he rejects Rashi's pshat in the pasuk, and he teaches it otherwise. So it's a very tricky question. When you say the Torah, like Shaila B'Bailim, where the Rishonim struggle to have any kind of explanation for that halacha at all, the fact that when you borrowed it, you asked the Bailim for a cup of water, and he gave you a cup of water, and you put it from all Shmira, right? So sometimes the tradition is so strong, it says, we don't understand it, maybe we can't understand it. But many, many times, the Torah builds on the fact that you're going to have a certain moral understanding. And part of this comes from the fact that Kadosh Baruch Hu is described as tzedek, kelemun avein ovel, tzaddik v'yashahu. If you didn't have those concepts and you couldn't use them, if everything that came in the Shema was automatically right, you could never read that pasuk. That pasuk is telling you something that you're supposed to be able to see, right? Tamur ki tov Hashem. So I'll call him the fool, the simple-minded says, how do you know what God means by good? Well, if I don't know what he means by good, how can he tell me to investigate and see it? I must understand it, otherwise he's not talking to me. And he told me, Tamur ki tov Hashem. So the Torah builds on a natural moral instinct. And it informs that instinct, and sometimes it says things which are contrary to that instinct, and then you learn to modify. The Chazon Ish on this, where he says that where you can't come to the conclusion without using the Torah sources on the subject. What about stealing someone's livelihood? Moving into a town which has room for only one, and the guy's there, and you move in, you set up shop, and you undercut his prices, and you drive him out of business, so on and so on. Well, that's all Hasagas Gvul, right? Certainly, and it's a logical rule, and it's a rule of tzedek and everything else. But there's one exception. That's the Talmud Torah. You can move in and you can set up competition and you can drive the guy out because you're a better teacher of Talmud Torah, and that's fine. The Torah didn't tell you that. You wouldn't believe that. You would say, if 5 minutes was livelihood, but Talmud Torah is more important than protecting the person's livelihood. Okay, the Torah has to tell me that. So certainly, you don't want to draw any conclusion on the basis of your own moral understanding without taking the Torah's input. I'm just pointing out that the Torah's input sometimes relies on that hasaga. It's a very subtle interplay of reliance, and I think different Rishonim function different ways. Tosfos in general is boldly independent. How many times does the Gemara say something, and Tosfos will say either lav dafka? There's even one place, I'll tell you, not have to quit because I have to teach upstairs. The Gemara says that lo tzatzaris Moav, because Rabbi told it to Moshe Rabbeinu because he made a kav v'chomer on its own. He says, since Midian hired Bilam to curse us, and Moab just went along for the ride, and it said we have made a war against Midian, so al chaskama v'kama, we would make a war against Moab. The Baruch said, no, in the case of Moab, I don't want you to make a war. Right? That's what the Gemara says. Tosfos says, lo hoyu v'lo nivra, it never happened. What the Gemara says never happened. And here's a very simple proof that the pasuk of not fighting with Moab comes before the war of Midian. Thank you very much. So it couldn't have been a reaction to it. No, what the Gemara means is like this. If the pasuk hadn't come before, if Moshe had only had the example of Midian, then Moshe would have, didn't really in the real world, but would have made a kal v'chomer, and then this pasuk would have been the answer to, man, oh man, a Shevitz, you know. The Gemara quotes the Kodesh Baruch Hu telling Moshe it's a wrong kal v'chomer, and so on. Tosfos says it didn't happen. Tosfos is very bold. And they're not less from, and they're not proto-conservative. They know that the Torah relies on logic, and its words rely on logic. And one of the most difficult things for me, because I'm a daikin in words, sometimes in Chazal you have to be a daik every word precisely, and sometimes you have to look them over. A number of times the Gemara says kal v'chomer, and Tosfos says lav davka, because give li milsa, but not a kal v'chomer. So the Gemara didn't really mean it. It said kal v'chomer, didn't really mean it. So this balance of relying on your own intellect and understanding versus sort of knuckling under to what the Gemara says and just taking it face value. Read the Gemara on the Maisim in Bava Basra, the river, and the animals and everything else. So it's all symbolic. All symbolic. Some places if you say that, they'll throw you out, but don't say it about Oram and Chava. That's all. Okay.